Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Absinthe Allure. I'm a burlesque performer and producer of the Speakeasy Review. Today we are going to be talking about a brief history of modern day burlesque so that you have a better understanding of what exactly we are getting ourselves into on this channel. This is by no means a complete history of burlesque, and I do recommend that you check out Bella Sin's Decolonizing Burlesque History course as well, for a little bit more of an extensive history as well as highlighting different performers through the years. One thing that's really important to understand when it comes to burlesque and burlesque history is that burlesque has always been political, whether that be because female sexuality is a taboo subject, or bodies, gender expression, parody especially of social classes, social constructs, politics, and the way that society interacts with women, AFAB people, or queer people as a whole. I often like to share this brief history of burlesque at my shows, especially if Speakeasy Review has been invited to be part of a festival or larger event, as well as for my Fresh Faced Follies shows where we invite brand new performers and people who maybe are unaware of burlesque and burlesque history to come in and really just appreciate where this all comes from. Burlesque is beyond just the sparkle and the tassels and the glitter and the tits. We're taking our brief history all the way back to England in the Victorian era. During this time, I want you to think about the social class and society as a whole and how that played into the popularity of burlesque theaters. At this time, there's a big separation between high society, where it's a predominantly white, full of generational wealth, and the behaviors and acceptable arts of this time period really cater to this higher class society. On the flip side, you have the working class, usually poorer, still fairly white because this is Victorian England, but people of color as well. And specifically in this subset, we have the artists and the actors. And this is important to keep in mind. If you wanted to go see live performances during the Victorian era and you were of high society, you were respectable, and you wanted to see actual art, you would go to the opera. And operas we still associate today with prestige and elegance and a certain level of privilege that comes with that art form. This is reminiscent of the time where this was acceptable theater. Opera performers were respected as actors and actresses and artists of their craft, and that couldn't be said for all performers. To counter this movement of opera being reserved for the upper class, our working class babes had to come up with something fun, and that created burlesque theaters. The term burlesque even can be translated to mock, because burlesque theaters were used as a political statement to not only entertain the working class, but also to poke fun at these standards of the time and these high society operas that were real art and real theater. In burlesque theaters, you often saw parodies of the operas that were being shown on the other side of town. And truly, these parodies would put the likes of Mel Brooks to shame with the amount of innuendos and jokes that were thrown in to further poke fun at high society and upper class. Within these burlesque theaters, there was notably a lot of women, a lot of queer people. There were, God forbid, women dressed in men's clothing, or drag performers? Who'd have thought? The plays were crude, the audiences were rowdy, and overall it was a celebration of bringing together the working class as a way of letting loose during this time. Burlesque theaters were an amazing way of bringing the working class together to not only entertain and have some fun, but to poke fun at the oppressive social class that is keeping them in the working class, and all of the politics that go along with it. Can't relate. Burlesque theaters were incredibly important to create entertainment for the working class, as well as giving them opportunities to come together to express some grievances and continue to poke fun at society as a whole, as well as gender and sexual expression. It's also important to note at this time that there's a very clear difference between the actors and actresses who did opera, and the rest of the actors and actresses. If you're familiar with movies like Moulin Rouge or stories like The Picture of Dorian Gray, you're probably not unfamiliar with the concept of budding actress isn't taken seriously, does all of these performances to try to gain respect and money and acclaim, and then often does sex work once they're off stage in order to support themselves. And it often wasn't until you were regarded as a real actress in real theater that you were able to get the acclaim and the money to support yourself without having to resort to sex work. This is a very common theme and a big part of what launched burlesque into what it is today. During the turn of the century, burlesque performers also took to vaudeville and began to travel, and that's how it came across to the United States. Even then, the vaudevillian take on burlesque was different than the burlesque that we know and love today. Oftentimes, this either incorporated belly dance or other similar art forms, or simply having a tent where you can go in and see a scantily dressed woman and, ooh, give her $1. A lot of classic burlesque moves do come directly from belly dance because, again, we think of the time period, we think of our audiences here in England and in the United States, and exotic dancing, especially ones that brought attention to your hips and your stomach. How scandalous! Frankly, in Western society at this time, any real movement was seen as scandalous, for harlots. We saw this again with Elvis Presley. God forbid that man move his hips on national TV. But it had a similar kind of vibe and disgust and acclaim and intrigue with belly dancing and, again, other similar forms of dance. Therefore, if you are familiar with belly dancing, if you dance belly dance yourself, or if you've seen it performed, especially in classic burlesque and especially in early burlesque, a lot of these moves are going to look pretty familiar to you. And a lot of early burlesque performers did classify themselves as belly dancers as well. During the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, we see jazz becoming much more popular, hemlines get a little shorter, we start rouging our knees, and this is also where the striptease element of burlesque comes into play historically. The 1920s were the 1920s for a variety of reasons. You had the end of World War I, you had the Great Depression, you had Spanish flu, and for reasons that we can now unfortunately relate to after our last pandemic, things got a little crazy once things opened back up. This is when we begin to see close ties with burlesque and jazz. Most classic burlesque has strong ties to jazz and blues music. And again, this is where we start revealing a couple of things. Now, not only is burlesque scandalous because, oh my gosh, those movements, and also, how dare a woman play with sexuality and gender roles and gender expression, now we're also stripping. Burlesque continues to be popular throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, throughout World War II, continues to have some fame in the 50s, and in the 1960s is when we see a drastic decline in burlesque performers. A big part of this is because, coincidentally, in the 1960s and 70s, we have the free love movement. We love the free love movement for feminism, current history, lots of strides in kind of getting us to where we are now as far as women being people goes. However, with this current revolution of women getting into politics and expressing themselves sexually and playing with gender and pushing against government in different forms, burlesque fell to the wayside and lost popularity. Granted, there was still absolutely burlesque performers from the 1960s to the 1990s. They just weren't as popular as they had been historically, and certainly not as popular as they are today. That is until about the 1990s, when we decided that jazz was cool again, and with the resurgence of jazz came back an interest in burlesque. We continue to see burlesque performers from the latter half of the 20th century continue to grow in popularity jazz becomes interesting again, burlesque becomes interesting again, and burlesque performers continue to work local gigs and take on different roles, especially in Vegas, with Vegas showgirls, Vegas and Atlanta strip clubs, and various other forms of adult entertainment. It is my personal opinion that burlesque started to become more popular on a mainstream level thanks to a couple of factors. First being Dita Von Teese. Dita Von Teese is considered the queen of tease. A lot of people are at least familiar or maybe have heard of Dita Von Teese if they cannot name a single other burlesque performer. And a big reason for this is because of her marriage in the early 2000s to Marilyn Manson. We can all have feelings about this marriage, but because of a big famous husband and social media, anyone heard of MySpace, starts coming onto the scene, Dita Von Teese quickly becomes very famous because of her husband, and she is a burlesque performer. That in and of itself is going to help garner headlines. There was also some movies during this time that sure helped the burlesque cause, including the movie Burlesque with Christina Aguilera and Cher, the jukebox musical Moulin Rouge, and in turn, the song Lady Marmalade. Since then, we've continued to see a notable rise in burlesque, especially in pop culture. We're seeing elements of burlesque in everything from the Taylor Swift Bejeweled music video, which featured Dita Von Teese in her signature martini act. During the halftime show with Usher, he had fans made from a feather fan company that caters primarily to burlesque performers. During the Blackpink Coachella set, again, we see fans and a fan routine reminiscent of early burlesque. And quite frankly, the entirety of Sabrina Carpenter's existence right now. Lots of burlesque influences, if I do say so myself. I personally have also continued to see a rise in burlesque on a more local level, especially with the current political climate, both because of the pandemic. We're seeing a rise in people now, after being cooped up in their homes, wanting to express themselves, as well as the current political climate in the United States especially. People are wanting to take back their bodies, they're wanting to express themselves, they're wanting to play with gender, they're wanting to create political satire, and burlesque simply isn't just for women. That is so important, and truly it never has been just for women. Since the beginning of burlesque, it's always been a play of gender and sexuality and politics. And of course, we welcome women in burlesque, we welcome men in burlesque, we welcome trans women in burlesque, trans men in burlesque, non-binary performers of all shapes and sizes. Burlesque truly is for everybody and every expression, and it's one of my favorite parts of the performance art form. There's so much that you can play with when it comes to costuming, gender expression, sexuality, and especially just the act of being a burlesque performer or a supporter of burlesque performers. It means that you're continuing to push back on outdated and restrictive views on sexuality, gender, and politics. Hopefully this video helped you at least get a little bit more of an understanding of what burlesque is and why we perform it today, as well as where it came from and why a lot of what we do today still harkens back to our early burlesque pioneers. The art form in and of itself, I feel, is a love letter not only to performers and people viewing it currently, but honoring those that came before us and continuing to honor those that will come after. I also want to take a second to make sure that we honor our modern day burlesque influences. We talked a little bit about how belly dancers, especially, as well as other dance forms, really influenced the beginnings of classic burlesque. And even today, if someone is performing classic burlesque, you'll often see some of those moves integrated into the performance. Once we had this revival of burlesque, we also saw more interest in what we call neo-burlesque. This is more modern burlesque and typically is performed to more modern songs. Modern day burlesque and pole fitness and heels dancing all is inspired by strippers in the stripper community. Specifically, Atlanta strip clubs is where a lot of these moves originate from. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that even though burlesque is sometimes called classy stripping, and I can go on a whole separate rant about how I think that that is very reductive and harmful to refer to burlesque as. But the majority of the moves that a lot of us love and use today can be traced back to Black performers in Atlanta strip clubs who do strip, and the sex work community as a whole. The othering that some people will use in talking about burlesque and the sex work community as a whole is personally problematic and not my jam. I would love to have another video where we go a little bit more into the nuances of that topic, but in short, while not every burlesque performer considers themselves a sex worker, they are adjacent. At the end of the day, we are taking our clothes off for money, and many performers within the burlesque community do sex work of some kind as well. So it harkens back to that community, we're supporting each other, we're all here and in this together mindset that I think is really important. I just wanted to pop back in here, acknowledge that because it's important, and potentially give another outlet for a future video topic. Again, if you're wanting to continue to learn more about burlesque history, I really recommend checking out the Beehoff Burlesque Hall of Fame Museum in Vegas if you happen to be visiting, as well as the digital course from Bella Sin on decolonizing burlesque history, as well as a few other topics that are, again, super helpful information. As always, if you found this video helpful, feel free to give this a like, subscribe to my channel if you would like to continue to learn more about burlesque and follow me along on my burlesque journey, and comment down below anything else that you would still like to learn about burlesque, whether that be history, current, present day, you're wanting to get into burlesque, or questions about me as a burlesque performer. I will see you all in my next video, and until then, bye!